we like really easy answers as human beings. And the point is, there is not an easy answer. It's not. So whenever people say it's like, oh, it's Christianity that's the problem, like, no, it's not. It's people. And by the way, if you look at Greco-Roman pagans, they were a whole lot worse, culturally speaking. So even like the whole idea of people as precious, the whole idea of human life as precious, which we take for granted, right? Like if you go down the street, you're not just thinking like, I could kill somebody here. The Romans did. For Romans, the whole idea of the world was to separate people into hierarchical categories, people who were valuable and people who were not. Christianity challenged all of this, the idea that every single one of us is equally precious in God's eyes because made in God's image. We owe this to the Judeo-Christian worldview. Once you start building on that, as the early church did, the whole idea of everybody in our midst is a child of God. When you start building on this, really beautiful things happen. But if they happen at the local congregational level. Whenever you see stories of somebody like Constantine trying to legislate something from far away, it never works out too well.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact and donate. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each week. And go leave a rating and review. It's easy. It only takes a second, and it helps us find new listeners to the show. Just go to the show page on the app that you're using right now and hit 5 stars. Thank you so much for doing that. Also, you can find us on social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, anywhere we're on social media at Shifting Culture Podcast. You could find us. We interact a lot there. So go find us, follow us, and interact so that you could get quotes and video clips and all sorts of things on social media. Previous guests on the show have included Nijay Gupta, Todd Hunter, and Amy Sherman. You can go back, listen to those episodes and more. But today's guest is Nadya Williams. Nadya Williams received her PhD in classics from Princeton University. She's the author of Cultural Christians in the Early Church and Priceless. She is book review editor for Current, where she also runs the Arena blog. Nadya and I talked through her book, Cultural Christians in the Early Church. Did you know that cultural Christianity has been a problem from the beginning? Giving in to worldly power and praise, apostasy and divisions in the church, Christian nationalism, celebrity culture, all of these things and more are problems the early church dealt with, and we still deal with them today. But there is good news. The way of Jesus is possible. And we even have models to follow who faithfully follow Jesus amidst the culture of the day. So join us as we discover what faithfulness to Jesus looks like, even when people around us are following the culture of the day instead of the radical way of Jesus. Here's my conversation with Nadya Williams. Well, Nadya, welcome to the podcast. I'm really excited to have you on. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your story. So, as you wrote Cultural Christians in the Early Church, I think we all come from a perspective and a life lived within the church and, with our families and family history. What's your story? What was it like growing up? How did you come to know Jesus?
So it's a more complicated story, perhaps, than a lot of people you talk to. I was born in the Soviet Union back when there was such a thing. And in 1991, right before the Soviet Union collapsed, my family immigrated to Israel. So I grew up in a secular Jewish family. Although we didn't really talk about this, I remember kind of finding out in like 91. It's like, oh, we're Jews. What does that mean? And anyway, so there we were in Israel. And then as I was in high school, about to start 10th grade, my dad got a 1-year job in the U.S., which then turned into another job. And long story short, we're still here. I didn't come to Christ as a result of all of these things, secular Jew, Israeli, all that. I didn't come to Christ until I was 30. And at that point, I call it my deconstruction. I know a lot of people, it's kind of fashionable. If you grew up in the church and had a horrible experience, you become an adult and you start deconstructing your faith. Well, I was a 30-year-old deconstructing my unbelief and trying to figure out like what was missing in my life because I knew something was missing, and ultimately came to Christ. And and that's really kind of, a lot of it was, I would say, connected to what I was studying as an academic, looking at the ancient world, and the realization as I was reading the Gospels that this is true, and having kind of that experience.
So as you started to look at your life and look at your faith and or lack of faith, and realize and started to look at the Gospels, what predicated you to start to look at the Gospels, to read the Gospels as you were studying the ancient world? And what were you particularly looking at that time?
I was reading a lot all at once. So, and one thing to keep in mind is ancient historians do read the New Testament as a historical source. So I was familiar with it before I started exploring Christianity. But when I was specifically looking at just evidence for God and evidence for Christianity, especially, it was really powerful to read the Gospels and realize that there are all these testimonies. And as historians, we work with primary sources. Well, and here we have primary sources. And the thing is, as a historian, I always tell students, I've always told students, we assume that our sources are not trying to deceive us. Sometimes they are, but the vast majority of the time, our sources tell us the story the way they think it happened. And seeing so many sources assembled together the way we do in the New Testament, all of them telling a consistent overall story, especially in the case of the Gospels, was really powerful.
So how does studying ancient texts and histories and looking in the past while living in the present, interacting in our daily lives, how does that impact the way that we interact with our daily lives, the way that we think, the way that we interact in the world?
So there are really two types of ancient historians. The ones who argue that we really need to lean on the differences between the ancient world and today. And then there are the ones like me who say, actually, if you look at the human experience, the way we are wired, the way God created us as people, a lot of what we see in antiquity is very similar to what we see today. And that especially involves problems in society. And that's kind of where I came. That's the angle from which I'm coming in this book, where we look at the concept of cultural Christianity, because everybody lives in a culture, like all of us. We are a product of our society, our culture. We really don't like this. And a lot of times we don't even realize this. But we live in a particular place and time, and it's really, really difficult to swim against the tide, no matter the time period in world history. So all people are very much the product of that world.
Yeah, I mean, when I was looking through your book, reading your book, I think the Beauty and the Beast song, "A tale as old as time, a song as old as rhyme," started going through my head. It's very similar to what's going on today. So we often think that, going back, early Christians, the early church were, I wouldn't call them perfect. They were full of sin, and I mean, Paul wouldn't have written all of his letters to churches if there weren't problems. There were massive problems in the early church, but one of them is cultural Christianity. So we have this problem today. There was this problem back in the early church. When you say cultural Christianity, what do you mean by cultural Christianity?
So cultural Christians are people that today we think of, especially we find them somewhere where Christianity is the dominant culture, like the Bible Belt, where I lived when I wrote this book. These are people who go to church on Sunday, most Sundays, maybe not every Sunday. On any survey or poll, they will proudly tell you they are Christians. but the vast majority of their lives is not necessarily governed by their Christian faith. So other than Sunday, if you look at them, if you interact with them any of the other 6 days in the week, you might not even be able to tell that they are believers because they are profoundly affected by the culture around them in the way they behave. So, for example, like how common now is cohabiting before marriage? Yeah. There are plenty of churchgoers who do things like that. And so this is an example of cultural Christianity.
So we're seeing that today, cohabiting. What was the sexual ethics like in Christianity in the early church? What was happening during that time? How did people be cultural Christians and not adhere to Jesus and what he was teaching?
So in this particular area, this is where we have a lot of evidence, say, from Paul. The church in Corinth, we hear in Paul's letter to them that the men in the church were frequenting prostitutes, which was totally commonplace, culturally acceptable in the Roman world. Nobody would have thought it was problematic in any way because men were held to a completely different standard, whereas women in the ancient world were expected to be respectable. So with Christianity, you had this scandalous expectation that both men and women were held up to the exact same standard of behavior in marriage, whereas suddenly, so for a lot of these Corinthian Christians, we see from Paul's letter, this was a surprise. I mean, at certain levels, surely they knew this. And yet, this is an example of where if the culture around you says this is totally fine, not a problem, it's very easy to just keep doing what everybody around you is doing. And that's just one of many examples.
There are a lot of examples. And so if we're looking at the culture around us, if we want to be, as it says, to be in the world, but not of the world, so we're in a particular time and place and culture around us, what does that look like? And how did early Christians do that well, and how did they fail at it?
A lot of it places responsibility on leaders like Paul and other thoughtful leaders. Later on, we see Ambrose, Augustine, Cyprian. So we see a lot of people who speak out against it. So a lot of times, that was the issue that I was looking in this book. We have the voices of these famous bishops and saints, leaders, who are saying something, and then we have these nameless multitudes. But we learn about these nameless multitudes and the problems of behavior and the problems of cultural Christianity precisely because of their letters, sermons, and so on. And so that's, but it shows the power of calling out sin, which is really uncomfortable. And we don't do it well either because, I mean, let's face it, who wants to confront somebody? Can you imagine sending the kind of letter that Paul wrote to a church today? The questions of authority and just kind of, it just gets really thorny, but it reminds us that there's so much that is expected of leaders in addition to just, I mean, certainly all Christians are called to pursue holiness, but the question is, who is going to help you lovingly pursue this path if you lose track?
Yeah. So what does it look like then for Christians in the early church? Did they have people around them to be able to move forward into a place of, sanctification, holiness towards Jesus, or were they left to their own devices? How did they start to look at these issues? What did correction look like as they moved forward towards Jesus?
We have cases like the Corinthians where we do know what it looked like, where Paul has a subsequent letter where we learn that they really did take his admonitions to heart. And that is really heartening. But we also learn of some churches that never seemed to fix these problems. So I look at, I have a chapter on apostasy as a problem that I argue was the result in some ways of just really poor management and behavior, even by elders in a church in Bithynia. And the result was just really high rates of apostasy in a particular church, instability. And that's the church that we know about both from pagan sources, so Pliny the Younger, who was governor of Bithynia, but also First Peter, who mentions persecution. So realizing that some of the persecution was the result of Christians turning in other Christians to Roman authority. And that's really just disturbing.
Set that up for us. Set up this church. What was happening? Why was there all this apostasy? How did it work?
We have this fascinating letter exchange from a governor, Pliny the Younger, who got to Bithynia around 111. And he writes this letter to Emperor Trajan, where he says, there's this group of people called Christians in my province. I'm not entirely sure what they are, but they seem trouble. I've heard that they're nothing but trouble, so I'm trying to deal with this. And he's asking Trajan, like, what should I do? And his protocol is always to set up the problem and tell Trajan what his kind of stopgap solution was, because then it would be another 3 to 6 months before Trajan could respond with what he should do. And he tells him in this case, well, I tortured a whole bunch of people. Well, I interrogated some people, tortured some others. So I definitely have reliable evidence. Oh, yeah, he did research. I mean, as modern historians, we talk about oral histories. And what Pliny gives us in his letter is, in a sense, kind of oral histories that he collected from different people. And he tells us that he got some anonymous reports, like a list of names. Here are the people who were reported to be part of the local church. Well, when he started interrogating these people, it turns out that some still were members, but others had left the church as many as 25 years earlier. So that gives us kind of an idea of a history, like how far back we go. And what we realized, from his report, is that there were Christians in Bithynia at least a quarter century before, so this puts us into the 90s. But at various points, there was a steady trickle of people out of the church. And the culminating point, when Pliny first got to the province, and he just issued a ban on on large group gatherings, that disbanded a lot more. So it's really fascinating to look at the kind of issues that are involved. So you have Christians ratting each other out, because, by the way, that's the important part. Who would send the governor this anonymous denunciation with all these names of Christians going back a quarter century? This had to be an inside job. Who else would know these things? And so you realize there's a lot of dysfunction going on in this church from somebody who might still be a member, which is just shocking. Maybe not a member at that point, but still somebody who had been until recently and just knows everything about this church and decides to use this knowledge to destroy it.
So what are the correlations to today? As we saw, this has been happening for a long time. There's quarrels within the church. There's people that are turning other church members in. There's a lot of dysfunction that's happening. What's happening today? How does it correlate? And why is the past not as good as we think it is?
Well, so that's a very direct correlation to us, and what First Peter talks about in regard to including that the Bithynia church, which is mentioned in that letter, that there's a special responsibility for elders to keep the peace and take care of the flock and just prevent those kinds of situations from getting out of control. There is a call to be compassionate, to love each other, even when you disagree, without going nuclear, which is basically the option here. Just turn them into Roman authority, knowing that those people might be facing execution. I mean, this is just a really serious degree of hatred. This is not just we're going to split this congregation. This is I want these people killed. It's pretty horrific when you think about it in those terms.
Yeah. And I mean, it does take some great elders, leaders to be able to do that well. And I think to set people up, it's a matter of discipleship towards Jesus. We need to look at what does it look like to be a disciple of Jesus and not just reflect the culture around us. So, as you started to do this research and you're researching these cultural Christians, what other facets and aspects of cultural Christianity did you find in the early church?
So there was a lot of seduction by prestige, if you will. So we all like to hear that job well done kind of compliments. And it seems like several of the cultural sins that I looked at fell into that category. So the very first chapter in the book looks at Ananias and Sapphira as an example of cultural Christians when it came to using their wealth. And what I'm arguing about them is that they very much leaned on the Greco-Roman idea of patronage. So patrons of a city would be people who would, spend a lot of money on their city, do a lot of public kind of benefactions, but they expect very public recognition for this. Maybe a nice statue, some plaques with their names on buildings, all those kinds of things, like very public prestige, essentially. And so we see Ananias and Sapphira, instead of wanting to benefit the church, like thinking about, we're doing this because we love our brothers and sisters in Christ, thinking instead, well, we really want to be praised for this. And that's something that hits hard because a lot of us, we want that recognition. Another example of this coming through later in the book is during a persecution in the midst of a pandemic in the mid-3rd century. We hear of some people who tell their pastor that they're not going to care for those who are sick and dying of the plague because they want to save themselves from martyrdom. And it's like, wait, what? It was one of those where you just kind of have to stop. Like, I really want to choose a fancier death, thanks. And their pastor really calls them out on it and says, like, this is not the way of Jesus.
That's crazy that they would want a better death, that they would want a greater martyrdom than actually caring for the sick and the poor, the ones that Jesus has called them into. I mean, that seems
There's
to
no
be...
glory there.
Yeah, well, there should be. I mean, that seems to be like what a good martyr would be. It's not just putting yourselves up on a cross and saying, this is who I am. So, we're looking at power, and I think and praise. I think power and praise has been a big temptation in the church for a lot of years, from the very beginning of the church, for the very beginning of the temptations of Jesus in the desert, and Satan tempts him with power and praise, adulation of all the people. Everybody will bow down to you and I'm going to give you all the kingdoms of the world. And so then it comes through the church. How did you see people wrestling with power and praise? And how has the church responded to that in a way that looks more like Jesus, where Jesus said, get away from me. Like, this is not what I'm going to give into. I'm not going to give in to this temptation. So how have you seen the church see the positive side of that, to not give in to temptation of power and praise?
I think that's a great question. And I think one of the clearest answers we see in the creation of the new heroes that the church encourages. And that's where the famous names come in, the martyrs. So the idea of like, my power is perfected in weakness is very much seen in martyrs. So when you look at Greek and Roman history, who are the heroes in Greek and Roman history? I mean, starting from Homer, you have the generals, you have the heroes killing other heroes on the battlefield, people who are strong, whose power is shown through all of the like violent exploits they can do. Well, you get to the early church and you see martyrs, a lot of times women, just really weak people who would never have been seen as heroes in the Greco-Roman world. And so I really appreciate the martyrdom account of Perpetua, who was martyred in the early 3rd century with her enslaved servant Felicity. So you have these two women, and you see Christianity as sort of like the great equalizer. We don't know which one of them converted the other or if somebody else brought them to Jesus. But either way, you have this noble woman and her slave, who are both very young mothers in probably right around age 20 or so, and they're in prison. And Perpetua writes her journal kind of her thoughts, prayers, visions before she is martyred. And it's a really powerful text because you see kind of her thinking through, what does it mean to do something unusual? Because women in the Roman world were expected to submit to the authority of their husbands and fathers. And her father pleads with her to renounce Jesus. And she refuses, which is just really striking and requires kind of this incredible power from her of a different sort. And here she is reflecting about all of this. And she also feels so many emotions. She's a nursing mother and she has to wean her baby while awaiting execution and give him to her parents. Felicity, who is with her, doesn't get a voice in this journal, but we know a little bit about her. She was pregnant and she gave birth in prison less than 24 hours before her martyrdom. So you have these incredible stories that were really powerful for onlookers. Most of the journal is Perpetua's writing. But then at the end, somebody, we don't know who, added a brief description of her actual martyrdom at the arena. And the narrator says even Romans, like these callous people who went to gladiatorial shows and executions regularly, were shocked and moved to see these like young women being martyred. But the really striking part of it all is that this text survived. And so to me, this is proof that there were local church leaders who wanted to preserve this account and thought this would be meaningful in character formation for local Christians. And it was. It became this early Christian bestseller.
Wow. They're looking at models. So I think, so your example here is we have some models that we can start to follow that actually shows us a different way, that a way that power and praise is not used for domination, violence, all sorts of other things where, Ananias and Sapphira, were destroyed because of. As we follow those models, is there any other ways that you saw the church dealing with these issues? We follow the way of Christ. Yes, he is our core model. We see saints and martyrs and other people that are disciples of Christ and actually following his way, and we follow them. Is there any other things that the church was able to do?
Bringing us back kind of to that initial point that all people live in their time period, culture, and all of that. The time period I'm covering here is from, I'm going from the age of Paul, basically, to Augustine. So you have a shift in culture. And so as a result, all of these little changes are happening. And a big one, of course, is when Constantine makes Christianity not illegal anymore, you have a different sort of cultural Christians arise. So I think one good example of to answer your question, would be the rise of the desert saints. So after Constantine, so you're looking in the 4th century, there are all these people who decide, you know what? If I want to be truly holy, I'm going to move into the desert and live on 3 figs a week. And it's really kind of incredible reading some of those some of the literature preserved about them, because it becomes this miraculous asceticism where these people are almost trying to, or maybe not almost, really trying to outdo each other, at least in the narratives that rose up about them, which are semi-mythologized, the number of figs per week that each subsequent saint lives on is smaller, and they're just being holy on their own, and they become objects of tourism attractions. So I have a chapter on this whole new tourism industry that developed in late antiquity, where people could travel around Egypt, and at different stops you got to see different saints living in really harsh desert conditions with really poor nutrition and so on. But the idea was here are these holy people, and it's almost like going to the zoo. And that's the language that is used. But the idea, it's entertainment, which is so reminiscent of what we see today with Christian celebrity culture. Look at these people. And there are all these collections of sayings, famous quotations from desert saints that circulate, which again contributes to that. And I was really wondering, as I was writing that chapter, to what extent is this sanctifying, and to what extent is it becoming entire entertainment? And it seems like some of the writers earlier on were wrestling with that as well.
I mean, there's a lot of incredible things that we get from the Desert Fathers and Mothers, and incredible sayings. And stuff that we can hold on to even today. So where is that line with entertainment and celebrity, as you see, going on in the early church is happening? And of course, it's not happening in American Christianity. We don't have any celebrity Christians at all. We have a lot of celebrity and, celebrities for Jesus that's really is destructive to, Christianity, the church as a whole, as seeing it as celebrity and entertainment. So what did that look like going all the way through this whole aspect of entertainment and celebrity?
The part that I thought about it was the most destructive is that you had this role model of ditch the local church, ditch the community, and go live on your own. And my argument is you cannot be fully you cannot serve God fully unless you are serving the local church, unless you are plugged in. And so I connect a lot of those desires to to the desire that some people have expressed to be wholly outside the church. It's like, I can be a Christian without the church. And my argument, it's like, no, you can't really. That's nice and tempting. But there is that extent in which this celebrity culture of people going off in the desert is destructive, because it's not really what most people are going to do. So the question from a practical standpoint, how can you serve? How can you be the hands and feet of Jesus in your community? And you're not doing this if you're living somewhere on a rock in the middle of the Egyptian desert.
What is the necessity of the communal aspect of the body of Christ? Jesus turns all of the society on its head, where now for the first time in history, you have people from all walks of life. We have slaves and we have masters, we have rich and poor, young and old, men and women all together. So what is that communal aspect of Christianity?
I think that communal aspect is going to be the mirror that calls you away from sin. Unless you are in community with other people, you will never be able to tell if you are a cultural Christian. I think about this, for example, with the qualifications for elders in Timothy and Titus. The whole idea, my husband and I joke about it a lot. How has marriage changed him? It really changed both of us, but we joke about it, especially with him, that just the idea that unless you are living in this family structure, you will never see all your little annoying habits and so on. And the same thing happens in the body of Christ. Unless you are with each other, unless you are caring for each other, whether you're married or not, unless you are in community with other Christians, you are not going to realize just how selfish you are, because all of us are naturally really self-centered. And that was something that I noticed in reading a lot of those sayings of the desert fathers and mothers. Can other people just get away from me? And maybe some of it I was thinking about it, especially because I have 3 kids and they're really loud. And there are moments where it's I remember joking a couple of years ago to another mom of little kids, how it's it would be so nice to just take a vacation on my own and not see anybody for a week. But that's exactly what they're doing, these desert fathers. And one famous quotation attributed to one of them as he rebukes somebody who came to see him, saying, well, since you've come to see me, you've driven God's voice away from me. And my thought is well, that's just so profoundly selfish. The whole point is, when we serve others, we see the face of Christ in others. And church community offers that. So whenever we say the presence of the church community drives away God's voice from me, this is suddenly becoming about you, not about God.
That's really good. That's a necessary thing for us to wrestle with and to figure out how can we be the mirror in the face of Jesus to each other, and lead us to God and in the midst of that. As you walk through some of this, you did see a lot of elements of Christian nationalism in the early church, and especially around the time where Constantine said, "Okay, Christianity is legal. We're ready to go." I mean, it's rife for Christian nationalism at that point. What's the parallels between our culture today in America and that time period as well with Christian nationalism?
I think that a time when you feel like something is lost, a time of crisis, is really ripe for those kinds of conversations. And so for the Romans, in 410, the city of Rome was sacked by the Goths. And it was just the most violent, traumatic event of the age for probably everyone living in the Roman Empire. And so for the few, the proud, the pagans still left in the empire, the big question was, how did we upset the gods that the gods would let this happen? And of course, they blamed Christians. For Christians, the question was, how would God allow Rome to be sacked? So there was this sense of betrayal, like, has God abandoned us? Because we have to remember, up to that point, Christianity had always existed in the context of the Roman Empire. So suddenly you have this idea, like, can Christianity even exist without a Roman Empire that is stable? And that's what Augustine really wrestles with in his City of God.
And talking about a view there, I think we're trying to wrestle with that in America and seeing America as this Christian nation. And we're saying, God has set America up. There's all sorts of parallels with Rome that we see. So how can we remain faithful to Jesus and living within a powerful state?
I think that's a really important question. And that's exactly the question that Augustine had in mind in writing City of God. What he's saying is it's okay to mourn this glory that you think is lost, but you have to remember that this city or this country is not the city of God. That this is temporary. We want to think this is so great, it's going to be here forever. But the point is, it's from God's perspective, it is temporary. So we're sinning whenever we make this an idol instead of thinking there is something else, something greater.
Yeah. So all the work that you do as you walk through the different facets of cultural Christians in the early church is really important for us to realize that it wasn't, the grass isn't greener back in the early church.
Definitely not.
We're wrestling with the same things, and we could learn from the early church and the mistakes that they made that we're already making again and again. My question is, as a historian, as you're researching all of this, coming to Christ at 30 and seeing all of the ways that Christianity has been distorted throughout the centuries, and then seeing it today in America and all the ways that Christianity is distorted, my question to you is, why do you still cling to Christ?
Because that's where you see the encouraging answers. On the one hand, you see this story of God's people being really awful and sinful in various points of time, but you also see really beautiful testimony. And that's part of the story too. Both exist. And where you see the beauty is exactly at that small local level. Local congregations, the stories of individual Christians who are pushing against culture, who are pointing others to push against culture, who are pursuing God and doing so in really beautiful ways. And so that's kind of, we like really easy answers as human beings. And the point is, there is not an easy answer. It's not. So whenever people say it's it's Christianity that's the problem, no, it's not. It's people. And by the way, if you look at Greco-Roman pagans, they were a whole lot worse, culturally speaking. So even the whole idea of people as precious, the whole idea of human life as precious, which we take for granted, right? If you go down the street, you're not just thinking I could kill somebody here. The Romans did. For Romans, the whole idea of the world was to separate people into hierarchical categories, people who were valuable and people who were not. Christianity challenged all of this, the idea that every single one of us is equally precious in God's eyes because made in God's image. We owe this to the Judeo-Christian worldview. Once you start building on that, as the early church did, the whole idea of everybody in our midst is a child of God. When you start building on this, really beautiful things happen. But if they happen at the local congregational level. Whenever you see stories of somebody like Constantine trying to legislate something from far away it never works out too well.
Yes, yeah. The local is where it's at, and it's good. So then, as you started to walk in and see this, how does your background as an immigrant into the United States, as an immigrant background, how has that shaped the way that you have seen all of this play out?
That's an interesting question, and I've been thinking about it a lot, especially recently, like with news, what's happening right now in Israel. I think the Christian ethic of love, of welcoming everyone, even if we don't live it perfectly, always, it's there, and that's exactly where churches have always excelled. So the period of the most rapid growth for the church was during the 3rd century, which is when the Roman Empire was going through a massive crisis. So it's striking that was the time when more converts than ever joined the church. So by the end of the 3rd century, we're up to like about 10% of the empire's Christian. And this is the period of persecutions too. So why is that? And Rodney Stark, the sociologist of Christianity, has argued that it's precisely because Christians were countercultural in their care for others, where the Romans were happy to let somebody starve or, die of the plague or whatever else. The Christians were the ones who cared for others, welcomed others, and so on. And I think this is a reminder to us today, a call for action at this age when there are refugees coming in from various really horrific backgrounds. And it's a reminder that churches can, and churches do, care for people in this way today.
Yeah. Well, I started, I think, 13 years ago or so. As I started working with refugees, I worked with a lot of Syrian refugees out of the Syrian war, and looking at UNHCR statistics on refugees. And so as I started to look, there was probably about 25 million refugees at that point. And that was 10 years ago. And the last time I looked, I think it was 2 years ago, it was over 90 million. It's just an exponential just growth of refugees because of conflict around the world. I think it is I'm passionate about it, but I think it is a call for Christians to welcome the foreigner, the immigrant, the refugee, the people that are displaced from their home, that we are called to give home to other people. And especially those that don't have a home. I mean, that's a part of what we need to do as a community. And so, yeah, I agree.
Well, and we see Augustine doing that. So part of the story behind City of God, because after Rome was sacked in 410, this was at that point a city of 1 million, and only a tiny fraction stayed in Rome afterwards. A lot of those people were refugees who went everywhere around the empire, including Augustine's own town of Hippo in North Africa.
What a great name. I just think of hippopotamus over and over again. That's good. I love this book, and I think it's important for us to wrestle with these issues, that these are not just ancient issues that Christians were going through. These are actually current issues for us today that we need to reckon with, and we need to call the church to a better way, a way that looks more like Jesus in community with one another. And so I really would recommend people to go out to buy this book, go get it and read it, and then start to put those things into practice that we were talking about. I have a couple questions here. One, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
I guess one possibility would be to think more about something beyond just academics, because I grew up in this typical immigrant family where it's like, school is everything. It's kind of funny to read about the tiger mom, because I realized I had a Russian tiger mom. That's basically what I had. But the whole point is that like one directional focus was not healthy, not good. But, on the other hand, as a Christian also, I would say like there's a problem with this question because we have to remember God's sovereignty over our lives. And when God finally like swept into my life, it really felt like God sweeping into my life. So
that's great. It's beautiful. He does that, doesn't he?
He does.
And it's
yes.
Cool. Anything that you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
I'm always reading a lot of ancient literature, even though, this is what I was trained in. So there's been a lot of that, but also more, just the last few years, I've been reading a lot more Russian things. So right now I'm writing a review for Current, the magazine where I'm book review editor, of this book that was really moving, Look at Him by Anna Starobinets. It's really sad memoir of that brought attention to really horrific views of life in the Russian medical system. So her baby was diagnosed with a fatal condition when she was 16 weeks pregnant, and it was just really heartbreaking and awful. But also I was thinking like there's so much of gospel truth that comes through. I don't think she's a believer. In fact, from what she says in the book, it's pretty clear she's not, but just this whole idea and how she titles the book, Look at Him, just the idea that because she wrestles when she has this baby and he's dead when he's born, and she just struggles, like, do I want to look at him? And eventually her husband convinces her to look at him and hold him, and it just becomes this really heartbreaking but healing moment. But I was just thinking, like, God looks at us. And just the practice of looking at others is this required, like this act of love.
So good. Nadya, if you could tell the listeners and any of your readers for this book, one thing that you would love for them to get out of it, what would you implore them to get out of this book?
Don't give up on the church. If you ever see these cultural sins in your church, and chances are you probably have, chances are you're one of them, one of those cultural sinners. All of us are. But don't give up on the church. Remember Jesus, and remember that you're called to love others.
That's good. Nadya, where can people get your book, connect with you? Where would you like to point people to?
So the book is up on both Zondervan website and Amazon. But also I write regularly for Current, and that's probably one easy place to find me.
Great. Well, Nadya, thank you for this conversation. Thank you that we could go down to the road of cultural sin and cultural Christians in the early church and reflect on what does it mean for us today. We can start to walk in a new and better way, a way that looks more like Jesus and not just the culture around us. So thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're really enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app. You could do it right now. Just hit that little plus. And then I would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So you could go right now to the show and leave a star rating and review and let us know how you are enjoying the show. And find us on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to connect, interact, I post a lot of quotes and different things that you could actually interact with the episodes and let me know how you are enjoying the show. If you feel inclined to donate, there is a support the show link in the show notes, and it would send you directly to a page where you could donate so that new episodes can be produced for your enjoyment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an incredible week.